Vamos a presentar al último disertante de la mañana, que es Sidney Himmel, que viene del Canadá. Es un biólogo, biotecnólogo y químico, esa es su formación, y hace más de 2 años que está trabajando en la industria del cannabis medicinal en Canadá y en producción de medicamentos en Canadá, y nos va a dar una visión conceptual de cómo se define el cannabis medicinal en el mundo. Es decir, ¿qué es cannabis medicinal? ¿De qué hablamos cuando hablamos de cannabis medicinal? Así que los dejo con Sidney. Gracias.
Hi. I'll have to give this in English. I apologize. I'm really happy to be here. I have a very specific thing that or purpose to this presentation. And the purpose is to address what does the term medical cannabis mean? And there's lots of other terms. What do they mean? And how are they used in different institutions, different countries, etc. Cannabis as a medicine, and incidentally recreational, is definitely coming to the world. But organic chemists, doctors, researchers, lawyers, governments, and different countries use the same words, and they all mean different things. And that's because this is a new field this time around. This talking through people or talking around people, because the words mean different things, is causing many, many problems, and will continue to do so as these products and these concepts become legitimized. And what I was hoping to do with this talk is to help address those specifically. So that's the purpose of the talk. There'll be a bit of overlap with some of the other speakers, but I've heard what some of them have spoken about, so I'll pass where there's some overlap. So the question is, when you address what is medical cannabis around the world, we're going to, as I mentioned, differentiate the different regimes. Already, when you mention the word cannabis, and you mention the most basic terms, if you Google medical cannabis, if you look at Leafy, if you look at the popular websites, when you do a Google of medical cannabis, you're going to get millions and millions of hits. And unfortunately, 98% of them are very naive, or very basic, or very primitive. They don't really get into depth. If you do a lot more research, you're going to find a lot more depth. But let me share with you what some of the problems are with the words. First of all, when they talk about cannabis, that does refer to a plant, but they use words like species, strains, and chemovars, and they're all used differently, and that confuses people like Jeff Sessions, and that confuses people who want to use it, and confuses doctors, because as the drug gets legitimized, or the product gets legitimized, doctors have to use them, and doctors are used to working with drugs which have been defined in 3,000-page books or monographs per drug, so this is complicated. The more popular term for the plant itself now, the better term is chemovar, and they're talking about the specific chemicals, the specific molecules in the plant. Something like 100, 120 cannabinoids, 20 or 30 terpenoids, a certain number of flavonoids. I won't get into it too much, but all these different things have an impact, and that's really how you can differentiate plants. The popular folks, historically, have used the concept of strains, because strains have different smells, different impacts, etc. So one strain or another strain is like one wine or another wine, but wines change from year to year, clearly, for people who drink wine. And the chemovars are therefore changed as well. So while a different wine from one region to another region is different, and from 2011 to 2015 is different, when you want doctors to use these as actual drugs, you can't have that variability. Or maybe you can have that variability, but that's going to be a new culture that's developing typically for physicians. The term species probably is not applicable because really all the stuff is one species. Now, if you look at the term marijuana, you see in these different studies, medical marijuana, medical cannabis. The truth of the matter is marijuana is both a legal term and a political term. Marijuana was not a term in this plant, which has been around for millions of years and was used medicinally, as mentioned in cultures previously. Marijuana was a legal term created in the United States when they wanted to outlaw the plant. It's now become a political term, focused Jeff Sessions, but the term is now modulating into perhaps a medical term. And that's why if you have a popular person from the 70s or 80s, or you've got Bob Marley talking about the product, or you've got Arno Heeskamp, who's a PhD from the Netherlands, or Dr. Mischulam, or Dr. Grotenhermen in German, they're talking different things. So also the concept of hemp. Hemp was an industrial term that came up through the British when they were colonizing a lot of the world. It's an industrial term, talks about the fibers from the plants, but the word hemp has now become a medical term because cannabidiol, CBD, in certain conditions legally can be moved around the world, but it's going to come from what they now call a hemp plant and not a cannabis plant. So already you can see there's 10 or 12 different words here which aren't clearly defined. When people speak about hemoglobin, that's defined. When people speak about aspirin, that's defined, or Viagra, that's defined. When you talk about apples and oranges, it's not quite defined really what those are exactly, but people sort of know. But apples and oranges aren't considered medicines, even though an apple a day keeps the doctor away. They could be defined as medicines, and probably some people would like to do that, but they're not. Cannabis is going from being a plant to being a medicine, so this whole terminology thing is a big deal. In various places around the world, they do talk about strains, even though when you speak to expert organic chemists or expert physiological cannabinoid experts who will be speaking here tomorrow, they don't really use the concept of indica or the concept of sativa. You don't see that in any of the scientific literature except for taxonomy. But in terms of the research on neurology, epilepsy, pain, you don't see those terms hardly used at all. They're not really necessarily relevant. They are a bit, but not obviously. Yet, when you look at the actual products produced in the Netherlands, Canada, and Israel, and these are by far the most advanced countries in the world for having a matured or a maturing medical cannabis space, they do use the terms cannabis indica, cannabis sativa, and that would include Bedrocan, who's the only producers right now in the Netherlands by law. That includes Tilray, Canopy, and others. Tilray ships to South America currently, and that includes Tikkun Olam from Israel. So already we see sources of problems and confusion which are going to have to get resolved over time if more than a handful of physicians in any one country are going to be dealing with the plant. And then you see from a Canadian company which sells products in Germany that sativas have these impacts and indicas have those impacts. And if you look at the popular literature on the web, you just look at it and all these popular sites come up, they say stuff like that, but the reality is, to be fair, there's very little wholesome evidence to support those differentiations. Now, when I said there's very little wholesome evidence, I could have said scientific evidence, but the problem with this space is that now you have to talk about what the word science means. There's pure science. If you want to do pure science, that costs trillions of dollars, billions of dollars, and to come to a conclusion takes 50 years. But people want to move more quickly with medicines, so they have regulatory science. Now the doctors, plus the lobbyists, plus the scientists start to define what science is, and that's a different kind of science. And then there's a further kind of more colloquial science. Well, these terms here, these are neither pure scientific terms, they're not even regulatory scientific terms, they're just more botanist type terms. So really these things aren't in and of themselves meaningful, And for anyone that's politically against legalizing cannabis medically, or for anyone who is prejudiced against looking at it objectively, there's going to be issues around that terminology, even though this terminology is very common. I'll quickly go through the concept of what is a drug. You're not going to see this type of a discussion, I don't think. I've been to a lot of these conferences, really talked about pretty much anywhere. I'm going to go through this because the underlying issues that people don't talk about, because they don't really think about it, but that cause the problems and cause people to get high blood pressure and get angry at each other and not be able to deal with it objectively, comes from these definitional issues. That's really what underlies it. According to the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, a drug has all these characteristics, but the biggest issue is it has to be in the official pharmacopoeia. It has to be called a drug. There's other things that are there as well, and because I haven't got that long, I'll pass on it, but that's what the definition of a drug is, plus these other aspects. And if somebody would like copies of these things, which are fairly detailed for slides, you know, if I find out what your email is, I'm happy to ship it on to you. This thing is actually pretty complete. You saw a bit of this in an earlier presentation. Suffice it to say, in 1881, cannabis was called a drug in the United States. But in the United States at that time, during the 19th century, drugs included many extracts from plants, and the extracts were not as well defined. That's the theory. They weren't as well defined in terms of organic chemistry as they are. So back in those days, since many drugs were plants and the chemistry wasn't well known, because chemistry really only got going in the 20th century, around 1900, they weren't that fussy about defining specific molecules. By 1937, chemistry was getting going, but the political movement against cannabis, which they then decided to call marijuana, was so bad, as the previous speaker mentioned, they put a tax on cannabis to try to get people to use it less, even though it was used, as was mentioned, as commonly as aspirin. On top of that, when they taxed it, they defined the product very, very specifically, which I'll be able to review briefly. That specific definition has a major impact on the international movement of CBD cannabidiol around the world. That definition is very, very important currently in Europe, also in the United States, and it also will influence how CBD can move around South America, and it also influences the actions of the International Narcotics Control Board, which is a board a lot of people don't hear about too much in this space, but that board, which is part of the United Nations, totally defines what's bad and what's not bad, what's criminal and not criminal around the world. So it got removed from the pharmacopoeia in 1942 in the United States. So basically, it was almost 100 years it was a drug, and it hasn't become a drug yet, an official medical drug that pharmaceutical companies can sell. I should also mention that there's a term called ethical drugs. It's funny that they call these things ethical drugs. Official big pharma drugs, aspirin, Viagra, diazepam, ACE inhibitors, those are called ethical drugs. So when you hear the term ethical drug, which you tend not to hear too much, that's an applied term which means a legitimized regulatory authority drug that if a doctor prescribes in accordance with a 250-page monograph, he's not going to lose his license as long as he follows the specific rules. To develop those drugs costs towards maybe more $1 billion, $1 billion. So if all the medical things people talk about right now about cannabis, I'm going to use the term cannaceuticals. I got the term cannaceuticals from Saul Kay in Israel. That's the term he uses to describe this new current kind of category of drugs. If all of these different cannaceuticals were to be converted into ethical drugs and be totally legitimized from a current government big pharma perspective, that would cost at least $100 billion to $200 billion, massive amounts of money. That's also a hidden issue people don't talk about. Then if you look at what is the drug, there's pharmaceutical equivalents. To have a pharmaceutical equivalent, you have to have the same active ingredients. Now, when you're going to hear the talks tomorrow, they're going to talk about CBD and THC. But they're not going to talk very much about CBN, THCV, CBC, CBG, CBDA, et cetera, or all kinds of terpenoids. Yet all those different molecules, according to very good literature from some of the best guys over the last 10 or 15 years, are very significant in determining how a natural plant or a plant medicine sort of works. All of those things are actually active ingredients. And if one was going to do with whatever medical cannabis means, cannaceuticals, or turn them into drugs, you have to deal probably with 50 or 60 molecules at the same time. That's tens or 20s to 30s or 50s or $100 billion. The drug regulators in the United States, Canada, Europe, Argentina, Colombia, where I operate, they're used to doing that kind of work. The general populace wants to use the product. A certain number of doctors want to use the product, whatever that means, cannaceuticals, but that kind of money can't be spent. So therefore, this helps to explain why it's taking so long to get these types of things approved and what the complexities are going to be. I can identify the problems. I can't give you all the answers, but I'm certainly trying to, from a regulatory and realistic perspective, define the problems. The scientists can tell you what happens in the lab, but as was previously said, to actually be able to make this thing legitimate from a legal sense, you can use it without getting arrested, politicians can be comfortable, these issues have to be addressed. And finally, you have the definition of therapeutic equivalence. So if two plants or two extracts or two different forms of molecules all come from the cannabis plant are considered to be the same therapy, not only do they have to have a molecular similarity, they have to be approved by the regulator, whether it's the FDA or someone in Argentina, et cetera. Again, very complex. I'm going to bypass my discussion on Sativex. Sativex is actually an extract of two cannabis plants. It is one of the it's actually as far as I can, in terms of a major product, it's the only approved international cannabis extract in the world. Yet if you look at the 250, or actually the 100 pages, if you look at the 100-page monograph on Sativex, it's approved in the UK, it's approved in France, it hasn't yet been approved in the United States. What you're going to find is they themselves use terminologies to describe the drugs, which aren't typically used, and Sativex is considered basically a botanical drug substance. If you look at drugs, you've got small molecules like aspirin, you have biologics like hemoglobin, that's a second category. Then you've got botanical drug substances. In the United States and in the Americas and in a lot of South America, there are thousands of drugs, but very few botanical drug substances. What GW Pharmaceuticals wanted to do was convert a cannabis extract into an accepted drug, and they went this route of botanical drug substances. You don't see research that most scientists will accept as ultimately useful on botanical drug substances to date. This is also a problem. Senna is a botanical drug substance. There's only two approved in the United States. Germany will have more, but even Germany differentiates phytotherapeutics, botanical drugs, from ethical drugs. So I should back up on that. Okay, actually, let me just back up a little bit. Yeah, this is how the company defines themselves. So they say they have two active ingredients, THC and CBD. There's other cannabinoids in there which are important, but they state they're not active. That's actually a bit of a non-truth. They are probably active, but they didn't want to spend even more money to study that. It would take another 20 years. And they even refer to terpenoids or terpenes being in there. Dr. Rousseau knows terpenes are important, but even this company didn't really want to get into it, but it was approved. That type of situation would not go through with a small molecule, a single molecule, but it does happen here. So you can see, again, the reasons for complexity. What brought medical cannabis back was two things. It was the epilepsy problem, and this is the famous girl, Charlotte Figi, who had refractory epilepsy, 5, 6 to 10 attacks a day, was going to die. And after the use of the Stanley Brothers product, basically got down to 2 or 3 episodes a month, and she went from that state to this state. That was one thing that got cannabis going in the last 8 or 9 years. And then there was Sanjay Gupta on CNN, and there was Montel Williams behind him, and lots of lobbying. After that, it was Dennis Perron who dealt with the AIDS crisis in California in the 1990s, dealt with the pain resulting from AIDS, the physical pain, and the pain resulting from treatments for AIDS and cancer. Got arrested many times, and there was lots of protests back in the 90s, and that caused the first law which tried to allow cannabis in the United States and California. Those are the two events that really got this back on track. I'm going to now just go through the various countries fairly quickly. In the Netherlands, which was the first country to really legitimize and regulate medical cannabis per se, the government states, or Bedrocan states, who's the only really allowed producer at present, that those are the major indications they've been referred to, but it's interesting. Chronic pain, 30%, anxiety, 18%, appetite, 10%, depression, insomnia. If you look at what the government writes, this is an official government statement, not a popular statement or a doctor's statement, so this is what's helping to legitimize it. They talk about those aspects plus other aspects like Tourette syndrome or glaucoma. If you compare that to the United States, as the speaker just said just now, two things about the U.S. Number one, none of the stuff I expected is accepted by the Food and Drug Administration. 0% efficacy, zero. Number two, when you look at the general study which was done, referred to by the National Academy of Sciences, they did speak about saying that glaucoma and Tourette, no evidence, or very minimal evidence, but the government indicates that's an acceptable condition. So the next thing you have, well, I'll just leave that for now. In the Netherlands, products like that are accepted. You can be sure that those are plants, those aren't extracts, and that's okay. That's a regulation. In terms of the regulations in Holland, the products are standardized. I can say for sure the plants are absolutely standardized. They've got 5 plants. They don't differentiate legally between THC and CBD in the plant. For example, in Colombia and Mexico, they have under 1% or over 1% THC. Those aren't applicable in the Netherlands. They actually allow smoking of plants. Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, there's no way they're going to allow smoking of the plants medically. But they also recommend vaporizing, which some of the countries do as well. Tinctures, teas, cookies. There's no way in South America, I think, you're going to see regulators or physicians suggest you use them in cookies. And self-titration is the term you're going to see very often. They're saying different people react differently. That's considered a concept in this space at present, and certainly a legal concept in Holland. The Ministry of Health regulates the product. Now, as you get the cannabis legitimized, you'll get the Ministry of Justice, you get the police, you get the international folks, you get agriculture involved, and they pass all the laws and write the laws. But there's no country in the world where at the end of the day, cannabis can be legitimized. Again, whatever cannabis means, what's the product, what exactly is it, and how, what part of the chain, until the Ministry of Health gets involved. Once you get involved with the Ministry of Health, you're dealing with PhDs, MDs, who have lived their entire career working with rules and regulations, tens of thousands of pages. So it's always going to end up with the Ministry of Health, that's for sure. And that's who handles it in the Netherlands. Netherlands also states for insurance purposes, but generally speaking, medical cannabis is not an ethical drug, i.e. it's not a drug. The physician has to write an official statement suggesting that the patient can use it, which means it's not a prescription because it's not a drug. In other countries, though, they have different rules. And the Dutch Health Insurance Board decided that in many cases not going to reimburse it because it's not a drug. A lot of insurers have been reimbursing it, but oddly enough, recently insurers are stopping reimbursing medical cannabis, a lot of them in the Netherlands. That's an interesting development. There are 5 specific products in the Netherlands. It's not like Israel. In Israel, you're going to find about 100 plants and about 10 or 12 different types of extracts from different producers, all pretty well defined. Those are the only 5 legitimate products. They had a high THC product that was getting some people stoned, if I can use that term. They didn't like it. They went to a lower THC product called Bedrobenol, 13.5%. These are all official statements from Bedrocan. That was too strong. Then they went to Bediol for some people, which is THC plus CBD. CB can ameliorate or impact the effect of THC. And then for epilepsy or for people who couldn't handle any THC for anti-inflammatory conditions and pain to some extent, they developed Bedrolite, which is 9% CBD. And finally, they even went along with this indica sativa concept and came up with Bedica. I could say a lot more about that, but suffice it to say, in the Netherlands, if you study that, you're going to see one very interesting system. Hasn't been even partially medicalized really, but it's been accepted as a new category of something, I'll call them again, cannaceuticals, and used fairly actively. In the Netherlands, you definitely have good agricultural practice, good manufacturing practice, International Standards Organization standards, so you can be sure the product doesn't have pesticides in it. The product doesn't have heavy metals in it. The product doesn't have metabolites from fungus in it. That for sure is highly regulated. Most other countries, it's not defined and not that regulated. These are issues that scientists don't need to talk about so far because they're dealing with pure molecules or plants which, let's say, are in Israel where it's also quite regulated. But these are major problems around the world. They also have risk factors. Every time a drug is approved, you have to have counterindications. You also have to talk about drug interactions. Different countries will talk about risk factors for cannabis. They've been defined to some extent. And what I can tell you is that the medical literature was reasonably okay in the 80s and 90s. There was, out of thousands of publications, there's probably about 50 or 60 major excellent papers. But the number of papers in very good medical journals like the Annals of Internal Medicine, Epilepsia, the Nature series, Cardiology, the number of articles from late 2016 to now, and the amount of research is improving dramatically. So that's a good sign. And they'll be looking at risk factors a lot more. You're going to hear cannabis has never killed anybody. You're going to hear, cannabis is not toxic. The reality is it does have toxicities. And there's a terrific article in Nature Cardiology, which is about 25 pages. I could give you the reference. They're now starting to study very carefully the toxic aspects of the cannabis as well. Anything can be toxic. If you drink too much water, you're going to die too. That can be toxic as well. So it's not a simple issue. On the United States, I'm going to go through this really quickly. There's 4 or 5 more countries. Various states have legalized cannabis. Well, the reality is, what the states are really doing is they're going to let you use it. The state troopers aren't going to arrest you, but people get arrested all the time by federal agents in the United States. And if you cross from one state to the next, you can and probably will get arrested. You'll end up in jail. Anyone who says that it's legalized in the United States is really dreaming. It is absolutely and totally illegal because of the federal laws. And I'll just note that the FDA has stated, not approved any product containing or derived from botanical marijuana. They have approved one drug, which is no more and no less than THC, that was produced synthetically in a lab. You could have just as easily used THC from the plant, but because they don't like the plants, because they haven't approved it. So the FDA says nothing that's botanical has been approved. And they go on and on. I could say more, but I'll leave it. In the United States, due to research, it's almost impossible. It's picked up a bit, but lots of people have been arrested with PhDs and MDs trying to do research. You've got the FDA on your back. You've got the Drug Enforcement Agency who doesn't like you. You have to obtain product from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. You can imagine how good that product would be if it comes from something called the National Institute of Drug Abuse. You've got the Drug Enforcement Agency. It's Schedule 1. Schedule 1 means it's not a drug. It's got no useful purpose whatsoever. And if you look at the publications of the National Institute of Health, which is a very scientific organization, most of those papers are trying to get people off cannabis. They're trying to tell you what's wrong with cannabis, although recently you're starting to see publications, scientific publications, which are talking about the organic chemistry, the biology, the molecular cell biology, which molecules may work, etc. It's getting better. Okay, and just a few quick comments. In Georgia, for example, they allowed people to use it for epilepsy. You'll notice it's called the Haley's Hope Act, compassionate legislation. And the state itself said, okay, if you're a physician and if you've documented everything, and if you want to use it for these purposes as a secondary or tertiary way, that's okay. We're not going to arrest you, but it's not a drug, and we're just doing this because we're compassionate people. In the state of New Mexico, the same type of things, various indications. The state says the purpose of the act is to allow beneficial use of medical cannabis in a regulated system for alleviating symptoms caused by debilitating medical conditions. There's rules about patient registration, rules about what physicians have to do, and the medical associations in those states have basically stated that if a doctor recommends the drug, I'm not even sure if they can call it prescribes the drug, then he's not going to lose his license. However, if a patient gets ill or something goes wrong, that doctor is going to have to show he's very knowledgeable in medical cannabis. And because medical cannabis as a drug, there's lots of information, but there's no textbooks and no major studies. It's not generally approved, really. It's hard for a doctor to show that he's very knowledgeable in those drugs. So it puts physicians in a very tough spot. It's going to be harder in South America and Mexico because the US has been at it for 20 years, Israel's at it for 30 years, Netherlands have been at it for 20 years. At least the doctors know what's probably going to work or not work. But in Germany, Australia, and South America, yet to be defined. So there's going to be challenges for sure. I'll pass on that. Can CBD be sold in the US? You pretty much have to have a PhD in law to answer that question. But the answer is that most of the CBD in the United States is illegal. There may be one type of CBD that's legal, but if you're interested, I could talk to you about it later, but I'll leave that for now. Marinol is a synthetic drug that's been approved. It's THC, nothing more, nothing less, but it had to be produced synthetically. The market's $150 million for Marinol. Marinol costs $12,000 per year. You can get the same impact using cannabis if it's clean and has all the other factors for $2,000 a year. So when these drugs become ethical drugs, the costs go up from 6 to 20 times as expensive, and in some cases 1,000 times as expensive. I'll give you an example. That's a major issue with cannabis, phytotherapeutics, plants, extracts versus drugs. The cost can vary by a factor of 10 to 1,000 times. Many people in South America or Mexico, their family income couldn't support the use of some of these ethical drugs, a major issue. Another synthetic sesame, I'll pass on that. That's THC. The reality is both of those are synthetic drugs, but believe it or not, it's also THC, but different pathways. I'll pass on that. This is a study which was referred to, 400-page study by the National Academy of Sciences. You can get that off the web, you can download all 400 pages. That association has been disbanded. You can't even talk to them. But they did pretty good work, and I was quite pleased to see that they thought that there was, and again, I'm happy to send this presentation to people. They did say there was conclusive or substantial evidence for chronic pain, it's workable. They give the evidence, antiemetics, it's workable, etc. But they do refer in many cases to Sativex, and they do refer to Marinol. They don't refer to a lot of the products people are actually using, like plant extracts. So they were very specific as to what products and delivery systems they were working about. They didn't say cannabis actually works in those areas, but they said certain approved types or certain approved molecules do. That's not what most people in the space are looking for. I'll pass on that for a shortage of time. Canada. In Canada, again, there's 3 jurisdictions which are very advanced. Canada is one of them. Cannabis is a Schedule II drug, which means the Canadians have accepted it has a use. It's not, but it is addictive, or it can be addictive and can be dangerous, but it has a use. In the US, it's a Schedule I drug, no use and can be addictive. Legislation came in Canada because of the court system. Everywhere else in the world, it was always the patients or potential patients who brought the legislation and brought the changes. It was lobbyists. It was never doctors. It was never researchers. It was never pharmaceutical companies. Patients have to be registered. You can only order from the websites of licensed producers. It costs at least $30 million to become a licensed producer, maybe $25 million. I know because I put them together. And not many people can afford to do that, and you can't order it anywhere else. There are many dispensaries in Canada. Most of them are illegal. Some weekends they get shut down, some weekends they don't. Every province is different. In Quebec, you'll get arrested. In Ontario, you're probably okay. In BC, you can go on as long as you want. So all kinds of different applications by the police. There are oils. Certain oils have been allowed by Health Canada. The maximum percentage is 3% CBD or THC. In Israel, you can get oils 20 up to 20%. For epilepsy, 15% CBD or more. Different countries are different. There's reasons that they have different percentages. They also haven't defined the oils, they haven't defined the impurities, etc. So still not as clearly defined as ethical drugs, but they only allow 3%. They don't want people to overdose on the stuff. They don't want people to vape it. And if you have olive oil that's 3% CBD, you're going to have a heck of a time vaping that. For the healthcare practitioner in Canada, they were told that if they were by the government on the legal side, they could make recommendations. Then the medical associations got involved, and because the court system said patients could use it, and because the government said, okay, let's get doctors involved, the medical associations had to get involved, and they said, okay, we're not going to go with the government wording, which is that you're going to give a recommendation. If a doctor says they're going to recommend it, it's a prescription, and therefore the doctor better be highly knowledgeable, highly educated, and very, very careful. So the doctor really is at risk when he prescribes the stuff. Now, cannabis is generally pretty safe. It's generally very safe. But if you've got arthritis, and if you've got gout, and if you've got a heart disease and all kinds of problems, because you're 65 or 70, and those are the people who actually tend to want to use it, now these drug interactions become very important. So doctors are really having to take lots of education and be very careful. But it explains why doctors, a lot of them, are hesitant. Neuropathic pain, the Pain Society, they have a consensus statement. They moved up cannabinoids, whatever that means, from illegal, not allowed, from the third way in which to treat pain if the first two methods don't work. And they moved it ahead of certain opioids. So that's a very positive statement. That's the document by Mary Lynch and Mark Ware talking about different ways of using it for pain. Mark Ware is one of the luminaries internationally in the world. It'd be nice to have him down here to speak, but you've got lots of good publications in the area. Canada right now, in terms of scientific exports and medical exports, on a very limited basis from Canada, you have exports to Chile and Brazil. Canopy in Canada has incorporated a company called Entourage, I think Phytopharm in Brazil, which is getting going. Chile has 2 producers. Tilray is exporting plants to Chile. Germany has passed the laws to allow medical cannabis in certain forms, but the Germans are so fussy that they haven't approved anyone to produce plants in Germany, and the system is very, very slow in getting going. I'll talk about that at the end of the talk if I get there. So right now they're importing plants from Canada, and Canada is also exporting to Croatia. Australia, very little happening in Australia. They passed laws with 100 pages or 200 pages of legislation, but almost no applications whatsoever because the laws are very tight and the doctors are working their way through the system, and that's where we find ourselves. This is information about what's being exported by Canadian companies. There's a company called Tetra Biopharma that's actually going through an ethical drug process for cannabis in some cases. When you want to get a drug approved, you have to go through 4 phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 costs $10 million. Phase 2 is going to cost you anywhere from $20 to $100 million, and phase 3 could cost billions. But that's happening, and I'm told I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to speed this up. There's more information there. Calaterra is a Canadian company working with Hebrew technology. There's a disease called graft versus host. If you get a complete blood transplant because you have cancer, in some cases the blood that you've taken on rejects the body, it kills you. They've actually found CBD works fantastic to alleviate that disease, and also in some cases to completely eliminate it. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is allowing the Canadian-Israeli company to take that drug through FDA in the United States. You should look that up, Calaterra, graft versus host. It's just an amazing development. There's some information about graft versus host. You heard a bit about Israel. In terms of doctors involved, regulations, trying to make it work, Israel, I would say, is the perfect model for anyone in South America, for any country. They're terrific at it, and it's good that Hebrew University is here. I could go on and on about what they're doing there and how well it's been documented. Suffice it to say, it took them 20 years to get there. So, you know, these things can take a while, and it's still improving. In Israel, by the way, as was mentioned, it's still the case, it's not a drug, but neurologists, psychiatrists, rheumatologists are using it, specific indications, PTSD absolutely used, autism absolutely used with very specific strains, plants, etc. So very educational. I'll bypass on that. Again, if you'd like to see this, contact me and I'll email it to you. That's Israel. Australia, suffice it to say, they've got new laws there. They have a single patient pathway and a patient class. If you've got epilepsy, you have to go to a neurologist. That's a class of drugs. If it's something which is less extreme, less specialized, a single doctor. But the doctor has to go to the government, get specific approval. So nothing is really happening here, it's being developed. But frankly, that's the way Israel built the system up. Last thing I'll do is I'll talk about Germany. There's more information in Australia, but the Australians actually allow these vaping machines, which is sort of interesting if you know what vaping is. And Germany. Germany this year just passed the laws, and they thought that it was going to work really well. Has to be doctor prescribed. It's viewed as an alternative therapy. It's got to be delivered by in a pharmacy. They're a new category called unprocessed drugs. As you can see, Argentina, Colombia, they all have to come up with these words, definitions, and concepts. The insurance system is just not working. What happened was the system got put in place, plants are being defined, whatever, but there's massive protests right now in Germany because there's no product, the system is blocked up, doctors don't know what to do, pharmacists are charging 10 euros to make a potion, which means something that was 20 euros a gram is now 30 euros a gram. And it's gotten so bad in Germany that, I'll go to a last slide. Yeah, let me just back up. This man is Franjo Grotenhermen. He's a physician. He's one of the top 10 published physicians in the whole space of medical cannabis. The situation has gotten so bad in Germany because of a lack of supply and confusion that he's gone on a hunger strike. So if you YouTube Franjo Grotenhermen, see how dedicated he is. He's written huge texts in this area and being very dominant and a big proponent. You should get him here to Argentina. He's gone on a hunger strike because it's even gotten worse. Before, so-called medical patients were allowed to grow their own plants. When Germany passed the laws trying to medicalize it all, they said you couldn't grow plants at home anymore. And now the courts are getting involved. So suffice it to say the following is where I'm concluding. Yes, it's quite clear that THC has its role. It's quite clear CBD has its role, plus the other molecules. It's quite clear there's an endocannabinoid system which is now being defined. But for this all to happen in any one country, the regulators, the lawyers have huge amounts of work to do. The communication has to improve. And I would say for Argentina, it'd be good to get people in from Canada, Israel, the Netherlands, to try to educate the regulators so that it can be done in as efficient way and a safe way as possible. Thank you very much.